The more you sweat in peace, the less you bleed in war. The wheels are in motion for a major economic downturn, war, unrest, and a very difficult time. In this video, I'm going to lay it out for you, including when I believe this will happen. There are a few moving pieces of the puzzle, with many of them being the effects on asset prices, the cost of living, divide between the haves and have-nots, and the polarity between the political parties. The bad news is nothing will stop this. In my view, it's not a matter of if, but rather when. When the time comes, it will simply be the severity of the war. Will the conflict be mild and isolated, or awful and widespread? I'm not saying it will be World War III. It could be, but to my previous point, the conflict may only be isolated to the US or another country which is failing at that time. It doesn't take a genius to see that assets all over the world have been rising at an astronomical rate. Stock markets, real estate, gold, and new assets such as Bitcoin and AI. Those not in the market are simply being left behind and are getting poorer each day, despite wages going up. They are not going up fast enough, they never will. Sure, there are the usual gyrations in the market, but zooming out just a little bit, you'll see that the overall trend has been up for a very long time. Rising asset prices comes at a cost. That cost isn't only inflation, but also the stress that comes with it. Many families are feeling the pinch, struggling to make ends meet, from paying the rent to putting food on the table as the price of everything just continues to rise. While these people and everyone else take the higher rents, mortgages, energy, food and fuel costs on the chin, the profits from these higher prices go into the pockets of big businesses. These businesses are posting record gains. Take a look at some recent articles, or even just the stock price of these companies. High interest rates on larger loans leads to tighter living conditions for the homeowner, but more profits for the banks. Is it the bank's fault? They're just a business trying to please shareholders. Is it the government's fault? They're just trying to keep 51% of voters happy to get elected again. Is it the rich people's fault who hold assets and just keep getting richer? They're just playing the money game, trying to put their family in the best possible position for the generations that follow them. This is an overly simplistic view, and there are certainly things banks, big businesses, and government can do to limit the effects. But I won't be discussing politics or policy. This video is explaining the recipe for where we're at and what is likely coming next. Government, big businesses, and rich people aside, the effects of all of this are the day-to-day stresses for the everyday person, which often leads to finger-pointing and looking for someone to blame. First, this starts on a small scale, and it grows and grows and grows. We began seeing the stress and unrest in 2020, riots breaking out, polarity in people's opinions, food rations at the grocery store, and even being locked up in our home. Since then, we've seen conflict with Russia and Ukraine, China and Taiwan, Israel and Palestine, not to mention the local conflicts, riots and protests in the UK, Europe, Canada, the US and Australia, to name a few. Many could argue that we're already in a war. It is a common view that every generation goes through at least one severe war, and for me, that time hasn't come, at least not yet. History often repeats itself in 80-year blocks, roughly the span of a human life. Those who lived through World War II, most of these folks have now passed on. This opens the likelihood of a very difficult period for all the generations that have come since the last major war. Human nature doesn't change, and to me, it seems obvious that every generation repeats the same or similar mistakes as past generations, which leads to very similar outcomes. You only need to open your eyes and look at what is happening around the world to see the continued conflict over who owns what land, or fighting over race or beliefs. This has been the same story since the start of time. So, when is the next war going to start? We'll start at the end and work backwards. 2026 is the year to watch. I'm going to show you why with some objective data. To do that, we must look back to look forward with over 300 years worth of data. We can go back further, but you'll probably agree that what you're about to see is enough. For us, the story starts in 1692, the Raid on York, also known as the Candlemas Massacre. We also have the 9 Years' War between 1688 and 1697. This is also known as the King William's War, which is the first intercolonial war. The midpoint of the 9 Years' War is 1692. From 1692, we add 84 years, which brings us to the 4th of July, 1776, the Revolutionary War, or the United States Declaration of Independence. To 1776, we add 84.75 years, which brings us to the 12th of April, 1861, the American Civil War. 81 years later brings us to the 7th of December, 1941, the attack on Pearl Harbor. There's a reason for the deviation, 81 years versus 84 to 85 years, which is outside the scope of this discussion, but rest assured there's a reason for this deviation. But 1941 is when the US was forced to enter World War II. Taking this cycle out another 84 to 85 years brings us out to 2025 or 2026. The attack of Pearl Harbor, the American Civil War, the Revolutionary War, and the 9 Years' War are the most significant wars of each generation, all of them roughly one human lifetime apart, or 84 to 85 years to be precise. The simplicity of this repeating pattern can easily be dismissed. There's a lot more to it than meets the eye. Also keep in mind that the upcoming potential war period has been known by many for decades, ahead of the conflicts which have been becoming increasingly widespread in recent years. I, for one, have been cognizant to the fact that civil tension would be rising, as would conflict between countries. I'm certainly not the only one, as many aware of these cycles were prepared. We now, unfortunately, have the proof. Widespread war doesn't come out of nowhere. There is a lead-up of stress, unrest, and division. In my view, what we are seeing now is the opening scene leading into the main act. So what does this mean for you, me, our family and friends? Leading into the endgame often sees asset prices continue to skyrocket before a major economic downturn, likely the largest downturn any of us have experienced. That means higher house prices, higher stock markets, and rising assets in general before a final peak and collapse. Until then, the general cost of living will continue to rise, which will put further stress on the everyday person. The divide between rich and poor will widen, polarity between political parties increases, leading to finger pointing and finding someone to blame for the mess. So if you don't have a way to take advantage of the endgame or a plan for a crash, then you may want to put some thought into this. With stress and unrest also likely to continue to rise, it is time to put you and your family in the best possible environment. Get grounded with a good community if you can. Create some distance between you and the mainstream outlets. As we have seen in recent years, they don't always share the most accurate or healthy advice. And finally, take care of your health, mental and physical. There is no substitute for this. And who knows, maybe all of this is nonsense and nothing happens at all. No one has a crystal ball. But for me, taking no action, considering the evidence before me, simply isn't an option. I hope our generation, my kids, or future grandkids don't have to live through a major war period, but so far, the odds aren't on our side. If you found some value in this video, please do share it around, as my aim is to help as many people as possible prepare for what is potentially coming up next. Wishing you and your loved ones all the health, wealth, and happiness in the world.